Imagine an island waking up to the first long light of history, a place where the sea breathes close enough to hear and the mountains sit like ancient guards. This is Crete, at the heart of the Aegean, where a new kind of civilization took shape in the Bronze Age and changed the world around it. In those centuries before classical Greece, something remarkable happened. People on this island became skilled builders, artists, sailors, and traders, and their society spread influence across the sea like a quiet, steady tide. Crete was where everything began, where people learned to shape beauty from stone and trade across the sea. Subscribe and tell us in the comments what speaks to you more, the creativity that built a new world or the courage that sailed into the unknown. To tell the story of the Minoans is to follow that tide and to listen for the many small sounds it made, the hammer striking a stone, the rhythm of a sail filling with wind, the splash of painted plaster when frescoes were set, the chatter of markets where pottery and metal changed hands. Their name, Minoan, was given centuries later by scholars who saw echoes of a legendary king, but the people themselves thought in terms of homes, palaces, and the sea. This narrative begins not with one sudden invention but with a long build-up, farming communities that grew wheat and olives, fishermen who learned the moods of neck-deep water, and craftspeople who learned to shape clay and metal with both patience and ingenuity. Crete's landscape shaped the Minoans in ways that are easy to underestimate. The island is a knot of ridges and valleys, creeks and fertile plains, with a coastline full of natural harbors that invited ships. Rivers were short and changeable, so communities clustered around reliable springs and coastal inlets. Those islands and coves made quick journeys by boat practical and encouraged the people who were comfortable with the sea to become ever more adventurous, connecting Crete not only to the mainland but to islands and coasts across the Aegean and beyond. The earliest seeds of Minoan society were planted in the Neolithic era, when small groups settled, domesticated animals, and spun threads of community life. Over centuries they learned to trim grain, tend goats, and store food for the lean weeks. Those necessities produced a surplus, and surplus invited specialization. Some people became potters, others weavers, some mined obsidian to make tools, while others labored at building more enduring structures. Gradually, the island supported more than bare survival, it supported culture. From these beginnings rose the first true urban centers of the Aegean, not cities of towers and fortifications, but palaces that functioned as hubs of administration, religion, and economic exchange. They were not palaces in the solitary, royal bedroom sense. They were sprawling complexes of rooms, courtyards, storage magazines, and workshops. Their walls were plastered and painted with scenes of life and ritual, and their layout shows a care for light, movement, and social ceremony. Think of them as living machines, designed to collect, store, and distribute goods, to host festivals, and to project the power and taste of their communities. Among these complexes, Knossos is the name that most quickly captures the imagination, a sprawling labyrinth of terraces and corridors perched near the north coast. When early explorers walked its ruins centuries ago, they imagined mythical labyrinths and bulls and kings. The popular story clings to those images, but the real marvel is the architecture itself, a palace that grew over centuries, its rooms arranged around light-washed courtyards, its columns painted red and narrowing toward the bottom, its stairways and storerooms hinting at an administrative sophistication. Knossos was less a fortress and more a public center where craft, ritual, and economy met. Other palace sites, like Phaistos, Malea, and Zakros, echoed similar patterns while each contributing local flavors to the Minoan repertoire. They were part of a network of centers that shared common architectural ideas, art styles, and likely bureaucratic practices. That network gave the Minoans both coherence and flexibility. They were neither a single uniform state nor merely a scattering of independent towns. Instead, their unity came from shared cultural signs and sustained maritime connections that allowed ideas and goods to travel faster than banners and armies. Art offers some of the clearest and most immediate evidence of Minoan life because it decorated the walls and objects people used every day. Frescoes stretched across palace walls and fluid, living scenes, fishermen hauling nets, youths leaping over bulls, dancers with ribbons and floral crowns moving against blue backgrounds. Nature appears with calm authority, dolphins, lilies, octopuses, and running hares, rendered with an easy, observant hand that suggests people who loved and understood the sea and the land. There is a sense of motion, a refusal to freeze life into rigid poses, which gives the scenes a remarkable vitality. Pottery too bears witness, not only in its utility but in its evolving taste and technical prowess. Early vessels were practical and plain, thick-walled and meant to hold olive oil or wine. Over generations, shapes became refined and surfaces polished. Painters found ways to make spirals and marine motifs that suggest both an eye for grace and a worldview centered on the surrounding waters. These ceramics were not only functional but communicative, traveling with traders and signaling where things came from and where they might be sold. The economy that supported all this creativity depended on trade made possible by the sea's highways. Minoan ships were built for speed and the carriage of delicate cargoes. They hugged coastlines and crossed open waters, carrying pottery, bronze tools, amber, and luxury goods. Crete had resources that were attractive: fine pottery, flax and textiles, storage jars filled with oils and wines, and a reputation for refined craft. In exchange, imports brought raw materials, metals, and ideas, and with them came the constant infusion of new techniques and fashions. This maritime commerce made the Minoans into more than islanders. It made them a cultural force across the eastern Mediterranean, a kind of early thalassocracy, a term meaning sea-based power. They did not rule by strict imperial administration stretched across continents, but they exerted influence through networks of trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. Minoan images of life, their pottery styles, and their technologies turned up in places that ranged from the Cyclades to the coasts of Anatolia and Egypt, which recognized in them something both exotic and familiar. Religion and ritual were central to Minoan life, but their gods and forms remain elusive because they left no explanatory texts. Instead, we infer beliefs from shrines, figurines, and ritual objects, carved stones and clay idols that often depict women in roles of prominence, or stylized vegetative symbols suggesting fertility rites. The so-called snake goddess figurines, small and intricately worked, hint at ancient priestesses and a spirituality engaged with the cycles of life and the power of nature. These artifacts suggest communal ceremonies, processions, and perhaps rites that used music, dance, and the dramatic architecture of palaces to create shared religious experience. One of the most famous ritual images is bull leaping, captured many times in frescoes and small votive objects. Whether it was a sport, a rite of passage, or a representation of myth, bull leaping presents athletes grasping the horns of bulls and somersaulting over them in a display of trust, dexterity, and danger. The motif speaks to a culture comfortable with theater and physical display, and to a symbolic language where human mastery and the forces of nature met in carefully staged encounters. It also reveals how Minoans dramatized power without necessarily relying on fortifications and military imagery. Speaking of fortifications, there is a remarkable absence of thick defensive walls at many palace sites, especially in the earlier periods. Where neighboring cultures consolidated themselves behind ramparts, many Minoan centers remained open and approachable, which suggests confidence in naval power or a social order that valued visibility and access. Yet that openness should not be mistaken for weakness. The sea itself acted as a shield, and Minoan vessels could respond swiftly to threats or use diplomacy and economic ties to diffuse conflict. The relationship between architecture and security in Minoan Crete is a reminder of how environment and social choice are deeply entangled. Craftsmanship in bronze and gold displayed technical sophistication that underpinned both daily life and ceremonial display. Minoans worked copper and tin to produce bronze tools and weapons, and they shaped gold into jewel-like objects that caught light and drew the eye. Metalworkers were artisans of careful taste. Their tools refined agricultural work, their weapons secured trade routes, and their ornaments presented status and identity. These crafts were supported by mining and trade networks that moved metals across long distances, showing once again how connected the island world was. The administrative side of Minoan life, visible especially in palace storerooms and archives, shows organization and record-keeping that made large-scale exchange possible. Clay tablets with impressed symbols served as tokens of account, little records for grain, oil, and textile storage. Among the most intriguing finds are tablets written in what scholars call Linear A script that remains largely undeciphered and thus keeps many secrets locked in its signs. Even without full translation, these tablets indicate a bureaucratic sophistication, categories, tallies, and repeated patterns that point to systems of resource distribution and governance. Where Linear A remains a cipher, Linear B offers a shadowy clue to later developments, though it belongs more to the Mycenaeans who came from the Greek mainland. Linear B turned out to be an early form of Greek and was used by Mycenaean administrators for similar accounting purposes. Its existence shows that writing in the Aegean world was versatile and that administrative systems could be adapted by different cultures. Yet the inability so far to read Linear A directly means we must rely on archaeology, art, and comparative clues to reconstruct much of Minoan social life. The everyday scene in a Minoan town or palace might include workshops humming with activity, storerooms stacked with amphorae, courtyards threaded with processions, and artisans engaged in tasks both utilitarian and beautiful. Women appear prominently in artistic representation, not only as decorative figures but as participants in religious and civic life, suggesting a society in which female roles were visible and influential. Children played with figurines and toys, and the careful burial goods left with the dead show a concern for continuity and family. These glimpses create an ensemble picture of a civilization where work, ritual, and aesthetics were tightly woven. Music filled ceremonies and daily routines, and while we cannot hear these ancient sounds, we can infer instruments from art and surviving remains. Lyres and flutes appear in frescoes, and small percussion instruments must have accompanied dances and rituals. Music's presence indicates a communal culture where rhythm and melody were used to bind people together in celebration and mourning, in work and in worship. Even absent the exact notes, the image of music moving through palace courtyards and harbor towns gives texture to the past. One of the most vivid ways to imagine the Minoan world is to picture its markets, where local goods and imported luxuries changed hands beneath open skies or awnings. Traders unloaded pottery stamped with distinctive spirals, perfumes walked in delicate glass, and metals gleamed under the sun as deals were struck and stories exchanged. The market was a place of information as much as commerce, where fashions were seen, alliances made, and the latest news from distant shores arrived by way of sailors. In that sense, markets functioned as arteries of culture, keeping the island's body alive with circulating goods and ideas. The maritime technology that sustained these economies was not merely functional but refined. Minoan ships had sleek hulls and well-crafted rigging, and sailors learned to read wind and swell in ways that maximized speed and safety. Navigation relied on coastal landmarks, the memory of currents, and the stars, producing a seafaring craft honed by generations of practice. This maritime mastery meant that Crete was never isolated. It was a node in a network that carried goods, craftsmen, and artistic motifs across the eastern Mediterranean. Foreign affairs came as much through trade as they did through diplomacy, and the Minoans seemed to have mastered the art of soft power. Their objects and styles were imitated, their religious imagery seemed to resonate with other peoples, their wines and oils were valued commodities. In exchange, they absorbed influences from Egypt, Anatolia, and the Levant, adopting motifs and technologies that fit local tastes and needs. The Minoan world was thus porous and inventive, willing to assimilate new ideas while maintaining a distinct aesthetic that was recognizable in its painted surfaces and refined forms. Culturally, the Minoans seem to have prized balance and lightness, not only in their art but in their approach to public life. Palaces welcomed light and breezes, frescoes celebrated motion and life, and courtyards created spaces for gathering and spectacle. This preference for openness may reflect a climate that encourages outdoor living, but it also hints at social values that prize display, ritual, and collective experience. Even funerary practices, varied across regions, included offerings and grave goods that suggest an afterlife imagined through continuity and care rather than a stark rupture. As the centuries unfolded, the Minoan world evolved through phases, each stretching the shape of its society a little differently. Early phases showed building and expansion with relatively simple structures, while later phases involved elaboration and reconstruction after earthquakes and fires. These cycles of growth, destruction, and rebuilding were part of the Mediterranean pattern, where geological and human forces constantly reshaped life. Each rebuilding phase brought new architectural ideas and fresher artwork, showing resilience and creativity in response to disruption. One of the themes ever present in Minoan history is the interplay between natural disaster and human adaptation. Crete sits on a restless earth, subject to earthquakes and, not far away, powerful volcanic eruptions such as the one on the island of Thera, known today as Santorini. The eruption on Thera was immense and sent shockwaves through the region, its ash reaching far and wide and its tsunamis unsettling coastal communities. The exact impact on Crete remains debated among scholars, but such events undoubtedly challenged Minoan resilience and forced social and economic adjustments. Earthquakes in particular explain part of the recurring pattern of palace destruction and renewal seen archaeologically. A strong quake could topple columns, break plaster, and collapse roofs, and yet the same site would often be rebuilt with renewed grandeur. This repetition suggests a society committed to continuity. Palaces were restored, not abandoned, and it reveals administrative resources capable of mobilizing labor and materials for reconstruction. Rebuilding itself became a creative act, an opportunity to refine design, heighten ornament, and reassert communal identity. During periods of reconstruction, art and architecture sometimes became bolder, perhaps as a deliberate statement of renewal. Frescoes acquired new palettes, columns adopted fresh proportions, and storage rooms grew more organized. Craftspersons experimented with metallurgy and pottery in ways that suggest a market quick to reward innovation. These cycles of destruction and invention underline an important point. In the Aegean world, crisis often bred creativity rather than collapse, at least for a time. Yet no civilization is immune to long-term pressures, and by the later Bronze Age changes in power dynamics were becoming clear across the Aegean. The rise of Mycenaean kingdoms on the Greek mainland introduced a rival political force capable of more militarized administration. Mycenaeans adopted elements of Minoan culture but also brought their own modes of governance and warfare, which had consequences for the balance of influence across the islands and coasts. Over time, the centralized, palace-centric world of the Minoans encountered the expansion of Mycenaean influence, and interactions between these cultures would become increasingly complex. Archaeology offers evidence of Mycenaean presence in Crete, especially in the later layers of some palaces where pottery with linear B script appears alongside Minoan imagery. This mingling of material culture indicates not only contact but integration of administrative practices and perhaps political takeover in some regions. How abrupt or negotiated that transition was remains a matter of scholarly debate, but the pattern suggests a diffusion of new powers into a landscape long shaped by Minoan sophistication. The Aegean, it seems, was always in flux, with long-standing centers adapting to new realities. The eventual decline of pure Minoan dominance did not erase their legacy, however, rather, it seeded later Greek culture with forms and ideas that would be inherited and transformed. Architectural principles, artistic motifs, religious iconography, and maritime trade habits persisted and were woven into the tapestry of Mycenaean and later Greek life. The palaces, even when reoccupied or repurposed, continued to be centers of economic and religious activity. In this sense, Minoan achievements became foundational to the cultures that followed, influencing Aegean identities for centuries. One of the enduring puzzles of the Minoan story is the question of political organization. Were these palaces part of a single centralized state or a federation of powerful local centers? The evidence points to a pattern of regional centers with shared cultural markers and administrative sophistication rather than a monolithic imperial control. Each palace seems to have managed local agriculture, craft production, and trade, coordinating complex tasks through scribes and officials. The idea of a collective identity enforced by shared ritual and material culture makes a compelling case for a networked society, one that balanced local autonomy with broader cultural unity. Language, for all its interpretive challenges, sits at the heart of understanding Minoan administration and identity. With linear A unreadable and linear B illustrating later Greek, we are left piecing together the picture through objects and context. Inscriptions on sealstones and clay tablets accompanied commodities as markers of ownership and bureaucratic entries, showing a written culture concerned with the practicalities of governance. These markings remind us that writing was not merely symbolic but a tool for organizing complex societies, even when the precise words remain silent to us. Seals and sealings give us a vivid sense of identity and authority in the Minoan world. Small carved stones pressed into clay-sealed storerooms and packages, and the images chosen for seals, animals, gods, patterns, told something about the person or institution that used them. These little impressions acted as signatures and security, an ancient form of authentication that connected legal practice with artistic expression. They reveal a society that valued both function and symbolism, wrapping commodities in meaning before they left the storeroom. Private life, as glimpsed through homes and burial customs, reveals intimacy and continuity. Houses in towns showed careful planning, with domestic altars and storage rooms indicating that ritual and practicality often coexisted under one roof. Graves contained jewelry, pottery, and tools, items that spoke of the deceased's social role and the family's desire to provide for them beyond death. These practices suggest a people who thought in terms of lineage and community, balancing the needs of the present with reverence for memory. Women, as represented in sculpture and fresco, often occupy central ceremonial roles, which has led many scholars to argue that Minoan society afforded them considerable social presence. Priestly roles, children in processions, and female deities appear frequently in the visual record, and the depiction of women in positions of prominence suggests gender dynamics that differ from the later classical Greek ideal. While the archaeological record cannot speak to private relations or legal rights with full clarity, the prominence of women in ritual contexts highlights a culture where feminine authority was visually, and likely socially, affirmed. The Minoan artistic language also weaves a subtle narrative of identity. The frequent use of natural motifs, wavy lines that recall water, spirals that allude to shells, and floral patterns that symbolize growth, anchors the culture in its maritime and agricultural surroundings. This iconography creates a consistent visual lexicon that communities across the island and beyond recognized and reproduced. Through these shared images, Minoans communicated values of renewal, abundance, and a respectful relationship with nature. Religious spaces came in many forms: palace shrines, open-air sanctuaries with views across the landscape, and humble household altars that brought the sacred into daily life. The variety of sacred spaces suggests a religion flexible enough to be both communal and personal, public festival and private devotion. Ritual objects, incense burners, figurines, libation vessels, attest to ceremonies designed to engage senses and emotions, to bind people together in the practice of common belief. These rituals reinforced social cohesion while giving expression to the mysteries of life and death. Minoan architecture carries with it a sense of theatricality that extends to religious performance and civic spectacle. Grand staircases, painted corridors, and open courts provided stages where processions could unfold and where the sight of painted figures on walls would complement live ritual. The palaces were designed to heighten perception, to use light and shadow, color and movement, to create experiences that impressed participants and observers alike. That attention to spectacle shows a culture conscious of image, presentation, and the power of collective experience. The influence of Minoan craft extended into textile production, where spinning and weaving were highly developed. Textiles functioned as practical clothing and as markers of status, their patterns and colors communicating identity and taste. Evidence suggests advanced techniques in weaving, possibly including the use of complex looms and pattern designs that required skill and patience. Textile production, often associated with women, contributed to an economy where finished goods held value equal to metals and pottery. Food and feasting played roles both practical and symbolic in Minoan society. Palaces stored large quantities of grain and oil, enabling feasts that bound communities together and affirmed social hierarchies. Feasting scenes and frescoes speak to the celebratory use of surplus, where shared meals and libations formed moments of communal memory and display. Such gatherings reinforced bonds, distributed wealth in ritualized ways, and made visible the power structures embedded within Minoan life. The maritime routes that connected Crete also connected it to the great civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean. Egyptian records and artifacts show contact, and we can detect the exchange of goods and ideas and objects found both on the island and abroad. Minoan pottery appears in Egyptian tombs, and Egyptian influences appear in Minoan art, suggesting a two-way traffic of artistic and technological inspiration. These ties remind us that Crete was not peripheral but central to a region of dynamic cultural interplay. Language and myth would later wrap Minoan memory in layers of legend, the most famous of which is the story of King Minos and the labyrinth where the Minotaur lay imprisoned. That myth, told and retold by Greek poets, draws upon images and practices of Crete, bull symbolism, sprawling palaces, and ritual enactments, and transforms them into narrative lessons about power, pride, and human cunning. Whether or not a central Minos ever ruled, the mythic overlays show how Minoan culture was remembered and reshaped by later storytellers into a kind of cultural shorthand that emphasized spectacle and drama. The process of archaeological discovery in Crete is itself a drama of imagination, careful excavation, and the steady patience of scholars and laborers. Early excavators peeled back layers of earth to reveal painted walls, storerooms, and the tangled records of human life. Each trench and broken tile rewrote assumptions and opened new questions about how people lived, worshipped, and ruled. The fieldwork continues to this day, with each new find reminding us that history is an ongoing conversation between past remains and present curiosity. Archaeological interpretation has evolved over time, moving from grand narratives shaped by classicist assumptions to approaches more sensitive to local variation and the material realities of life. Scholars now pay closer attention to household archaeology, the role of craft specialization, and the economic networks that underpinned elite displays. Interpretations have become more conservative about assuming political structures and more imaginative about understanding daily life in nuanced ways. This intellectual evolution mirrors the deeper complexity of the evidence itself, messy, variegated, and open to many readings. Technological studies of metallurgy, ceramics, and even residue analysis have enriched our understanding by revealing what ancient objects were made of and how they were used. Chemical traces on pottery tell us what foods were stored and consumed, metallurgical analyses reveal trade routes for copper and tin, and microscopic study of pigments shows how fresco painters mixed colors and applied surfaces. These methods transform static objects into living records, letting us reconstruct not only form but also use and meaning. They bring us closer to the practicalities of Minoan life. Consider the sensory world of a Minoan street, the smell of olive oil and baking bread, the bright glare of color in the sun, the clink of bronze at the smithy, the sea's salt on the breeze, and the muffled murmur of argument and negotiation. That composite, imagined through evidence and informed imagination, helps bridge the gap between modern ears and ancient voices. It reminds us that the people of Crete were human in ways we recognize, working, worshiping, laughing, mourning, and their culture was a lived, sensory reality, not only a collection of artifacts. When we look at the bigger picture, the Minoans belong to a long chain of Mediterranean societies that learned to exploit their environments and to use the sea as a medium of connection rather than a barrier. They show how an island can be a hub, not a backwater, when its people develop maritime skills, craft excellence, and administrative competence. Their achievements in art and architecture, their mastery of seafaring, and their active role in regional trade networks all combine to make the Minoans builders in a very literal and metaphorical sense. Builders of palaces, of markets, of ritual, and of enduring cultural currents. Their art continues to arrest the imagination, not simply for its beauty but for its narrative power, the way it frames lives and moments in strokes of color and motion. Frescoes capture the joy of movement, the solemnity of ritual, and the everyday grace of human life. These images are not static decorations, they are performances rendered in paint, scenes meant to be seen and remembered. In that sense, Minoan walls still speak to us across the millennia, offering gestures that a listener's mind can complete with empathy and curiosity. In considering the fall of Minoan dominance, it's important to resist overly simple explanations. Natural disasters such as earthquakes and volcanic eruptions certainly stressed societies, but social factors like shifting trade networks, the rise of new powers, and internal political change also played roles. The transition to Mycenaean influence was likely a complex mixture of economic shifts, cultural exchange, and political realignment rather than a single catastrophic event. History rarely follows a single script, and the end of one era often bleeds into the beginning of another through gradual processes and abrupt shocks combined. The legacy of the Minoans persisted in tangible and intangible ways. Material forms, pottery shapes, architectural elements, motifs, continued to appear in later cultures. Ritual practices and iconographies were adapted, their meanings sometimes transformed, sometimes preserved. Most importantly, Minoan achievements served as a foundation that allowed subsequent Mediterranean cultures to build artistic and administrative innovations on top of a pre-existing base of experience and skill. For the modern listener, the story of the Minoans offers more than archaeological detail. It provides a model of how human societies interact with their environment, how creativity can flourish in surprising places, and how trade and cultural exchange make distant communities neighbors in practice if not in geography. Theirs is a tale of adaptability, aesthetic daring, and the persistent human need to create meaning through objects and ritual. In listening to that tale, we find both a mirror and a window, a mirror reflecting patterns of human ingenuity, and a window opening onto a distant time that still speaks to fundamental human concerns. It is easy to romanticize the past, to imagine frescoed courtyards as endless festivals, or to flatten complex social histories into neat moral lessons. But part of the thrill of studying the Minoans is confronting that tension, the fragments of a world that simultaneously invites romantic reconstruction and demands rigorous interrogation. Each shard of pottery, each bent nail of a collapsed beam, each faded pigment gives us a line in a story that is both plaintive and unexpectedly familiar. That story is not finished. New digs and new methods continue to add pages. The ongoing work in museums and universities keeps the Minoan world in conversation with modern publics. Exhibits bring vivid objects to life, and careful interpretation frames them within broader Mediterranean history. Students of archaeology, history, and art history visit Crete, pore over stratigraphy, and refine chronologies. That living attention is part of the modern legacy, a form of respect that translates curiosity into stewardship and knowledge. Travelers to Crete today walk among ruins that hold echoes but not direct voices, and yet those ruins carry a palpable presence. Sunlight spills across worn stone, and the sea glitters on all horizons, reminding visitors that location matters to history. Standing amidst broken columns and painted plaster, one can feel the pull of continuity, how inhabitants of the past shaped space in ways that still affect the landscape and the imagination. The sense of living history that radiates from those sites is one of the Minoans' continuing gifts to us. To imagine Crete at the height of Minoan civilization is to picture a place of energy and openness, a world in which art and commerce, ritual and politics were held in a delicate balance. Their palaces were stages where the community acted out ideals of order and renewal. Their ships were conduits of exchange that kept the island plugged into a wider web of influences. The combination of practical administration and aesthetic expression made the Minoans a culture of both management and taste, where the efficient storage of grain and the painted grace of a dolphin fresco both mattered deeply. As we return to the beginning of this narrative, it is worth noting that the Minoans were pioneers of a distinctly Aegean modernity, a set of practices that used the sea to connect, art to communicate, and architecture to organize social life. They remind us that civilization need not always be measured by fortresses and conquest. Sometimes it is best measured by nets, amphorae, frescoes, and the quiet competence of administration. Their success was woven from threads that were both practical and beautiful, and that blend is what made Crete a beacon. History, like the sea that carried Minoan ships, is never static. The story of the Minoans shifts as new evidence comes to light and as new questions arise about identity, power, and daily life. Archaeology and scholarship are ongoing conversations, and each generation of researchers brings fresh eyes and new technologies to bear on the past. For listeners who find themselves driving down a highway or sitting in a late-night room, the Minoan story offers an open-ended invitation to imagine, to question, and to keep listening as the fragments of history continue to speak. There is still so much to discover, and that open horizon is part of the allure. New excavations might reveal fresher insights into Linear A, or uncover unexpected trade links, or show ritual practices in greater detail. Scientific advances in dating, residue analysis, and remote sensing promise to sharpen our view of ancient life. Every discovery reframes old questions and pushes us to think more carefully about how people in the past organized their worlds and made meaning of them. Even when scholarship is uncertain, the material reality of Minoan art and architecture provides a powerful window into how human creativity can flourish in a specific place and era. Knossos and the other palaces offer lessons in design, from the flow of light through courtyards to the color palettes that enliven walls. The Minoan aesthetic prized movement and depth, producing images that invite the eye to move and imagine. Through that aesthetic, they communicated social values and structured experience, reminding us that art is not merely decoration but a social technology. Lastly, there is an ethical facet to the study of ancient cultures. How we remember is shaped by how we care for remains and interpret them. The Minoan legacy teaches a lesson of humility and stewardship, urging us to protect archaeological heritage so that future listeners can continue to learn. Museums, governments, and local communities share responsibility for these remnants of the past, and that duty transforms curiosity into conservation. In that sense, preserving the Minoan record is a contemporary act of respect for human creativity across time. So when you next imagine the Minoans, think beyond the mythic headline of bulls and labyrinths. Picture a sunlit courtyard alive with frescoed figures, a busy harbor where ships trade their wares, workshops where bronze and gold gleam under careful hands, and a community that balanced ritual and administration with an artistry that still speaks. The Minoans were builders, but not merely of stone. They built systems, networks, and images that resonated far beyond their island. Their story invites us to savor the details and to appreciate how deeply human ingenuity can shape a world. And as the long afternoon of history moves on, the ruins of Crete remain a testimony to that ingenuity. They stand as open books with some pages missing, pages that invite us to turn them slowly and listen carefully to every fragment of the past. In listening, we join a chain of curiosity that stretches from antiquity to the present and forward into an uncertain, promising future. The Minoans, in their craftsmanship and coastal courage, remind us that human societies are at once fragile and remarkably inventive, capable of building beauty amid the storms of time. Imagine a coastline where light first touches Europe, where the sea holds the day's first breath and the wind tells stories older than any king. This is Crete in the late Bronze Age, a place shaped by water and stone, where palms and cypresses lean toward the sky as if listening for a voice. For the people who lived here, life and spirit were braided tightly together, and their gods walked with them through courtyards, frescoed halls, and the low, cool mouths of sacred caves. Crete was a world where sea and spirit were one. Subscribe and share in the comments what moves you more, the power of the gods beside them or the quiet devotion of those who believed. When we speak of Minoan religion, we are speaking of an intimacy with the natural world that was made ritual. Their gods were not distant, capricious beings on a mountaintop. They were present in animals, in the sea, in trees and caves, and in sudden flashes of color painted on palace walls. The Minoans organized their lives around a pattern of rites and images that made the wildness of nature legible and reverent, placing offerings where light or water or a bull's horns seemed to point the way. Knossos, Phaistos, Malia, Zakros, these names are like refrains in a long song, each palace a stanza filled with columns, frescoes, courtyards, and chambers. The palaces were not merely administrative hubs, they were stage and scaffold for religious life. Broad courts opened to the sky, rooms gathered at odd angles, and stairways climbed like promises, all designed to shape movement and attention, to make a worshiper aware that they were stepping through a sacred choreography. Step into a palace courtyard in your mind, sunlight pools on worn stone, voices echo, artisans set down tools, and somewhere near a column painted in red and black a priestess might move with a small procession. The frescoes record not only gods and mythical beasts, but the people who honored them, youths leaping, women with bare breasts and long skirts, animals caught mid-motion. Those painted moments are not decorative afterthoughts, they are living testimony to rituals that required bodies, breath, and risk. The most famous image that keeps returning is the bull. Bulls appear on seals, on frescoes, on clay figurines, their muscular bodies turning in painted friezes as if mid-leap. What the bull meant likely varied across time and place, but its recurring presence suggests power, fertility, and a kind of sacred danger. To touch a bull in ritual was to brush against the wild, to flirt with forces that could not be domesticated entirely. Bull-leaping frescoes give us the drama of the act. An athlete places hands on the horns, vaults, and the body flips like a comet. Scholars have argued over whether these scenes depict sport, initiation, or sacrifice, and the truth may be that it was all of these at once. The bull is both a creature and a symbol, an axis around which human daring and divine presence rotate, and the leap itself is an embodied prayer that asks for favor and courage. A recurring emblem in Minoan art is the double axe, the labris, which cut through stone as easily as it cut through metaphorical silence. It appears in shrines carved into rocks and on terracotta votives, sometimes paired with horns of consecration that mimic bull's horns and point to the sky. The labris has been read as a symbol of authority, of ritual power, and perhaps of the palace itself. In later myth it becomes part of the labyrinth's story, but originally it was a ritual instrument embedded in lived practice. The labyrinth, in the popular imagination, is a monstrous maze beneath Knossos. In ancient tales it housed the Minotaur, half man, half bull, and demanded human youths as tribute. Yet the Minoan sense of labyrinth might not have denoted a literal subterranean maze, but a complex plan of space and ritual. The palace, with its winding corridors, its hierarchies of rooms and thresholds, could itself be a labyrinth, a place where belonging and danger were understood through navigation. Myths that later Greeks told, of Minos, Pasiphae, Ariadne, and Theseus, are not straightforward histories, but they preserve the hum of older memories transformed into narrative. Minos, a king recast as a judge of the dead in later myth, may represent the political memory of palace-centered authority. Pasiphae, who bears the Minotaur, and Ariadne, who aids Theseus, both dance on the border between divine and human, hinting that the Minoan religious world made room for beings who were neither wholly mortal nor wholly god. The Minotaur itself is a symbol dense with meanings. A creature born from a union of power and transgression, it stands at the intersection of bull cult and human sacrifice, of rule and revolt. The later Greeks tell it as a monstrous thing to be slain, but the Minoans, who painted bulls with reverence, might have understood the bull-human figure as an ambivalent emblem, at once feared, honored, and essential to ritual imagination. Ariadne's thread, which saved Theseus from the labyrinth, is a striking piece of mythic psychology. String as a way to hold oneself together in a confusing world. In ritual terms, that thread might stand for rites and knowledge that guide a person through the palace's symbolic complexity. The story compresses many layers: political submission, religious initiation, and the hope for human cunning to temper sacred danger. Priestesses seem to have played a central public role in Minoan worship. Frescoes show women with elaborate dress and stylized coiffures presiding over ceremonies, and clay figurines suggest that female figures were commonly offered as votives. Scholars have debated whether Minoan religion was matrifocal, goddess-centered, or simply balanced in gendered practice. Regardless of the precise structure, women held visible positions of sanctity and ritual performance. The figure often called the goddess in Minoan studies appears in many forms: a standing figure with raised arms, a figure flanked by animals, or a woman with snakes coiled in her hands. These images were sometimes small and portable, meant for personal devotion, and at other times monumental, commanding a public place. What they indicate most strongly is a spiritual language that centered female presence and animal kinship, a practice that linked fertility and the natural cycles of earth and sea. Snakes are another recurring motif, small serpentine figurines clasped in hands, painted snakes winding along walls, and carved serpents in shrines. Snakes have long been connected to the earth and underworld, their bodies sliding between the visible and invisible. In many ancient cultures, they symbolize regeneration because of their shedding scales, so for the Minoans, a snake could be both guardian and mediator between life and death. Caves and mountain peaks were essential places of worship, threaded into the Minoan geography of the sacred. A cave's mouth can be read as an entrance to the underworld, and in certain caves archaeologists have found votive offerings of weapons, figurines, and pottery. The use of caves suggests that the Minoans made deliberate distinctions between kinds of sacred space: open courtyards for communal ceremonies, closed sanctuaries for secret rites, and natural grottos for chthonic communion. Peak sanctuaries on high ridgelines reveal that Minoan piety climbed upward as often as it delved downward. Tiny clay human figurines, often headless or abstracted, were left at these high places, perhaps as gifts to the gods of weather and fertility. Bringing offerings to a windy top is an act of trust. As the gift is exposed to the elements, it testifies to a faith that required sacrifice not only of objects but of labor and risk. Feasting must have been central to social and religious life. Communal tables, storerooms filled with jars for grain and oil, and iconography depicting banquets suggest that rites often culminated in shared meals. Food in such contexts becomes fuel for social bonds and a medium for sanctity. Eating together reenacts cosmology, creating community from scattered lives and binding them to the palace and its rituals. Libations, too, are implied in fresco scenes of vessels and pouring. The act of pouring liquid, wine, oil, or water, connects the human and divine by offering something ephemeral to entities that might answer through harvests or calm seas. Such gestures are small but profoundly communicative: the vessel lowered, the hand tipped, the sound of liquid on stone, all mark an exchange between mortal patience and divine attention. Offerings ranged from everyday objects to deliberately crafted votives. Tiny baked clay animals, stylized human figures, and miniature tools speak of ordinary people participating in extraordinary exchange. These offerings create a web of material devotion that anchors belief. Objects that survive in the earth become testimony to prayers once whispered and promises once given. The sea itself was a great deity in Minoan thought, or at least a living presence that demanded reverence. Crete's people were sailors and traders, and the rhythm of tides and storms governed economy and fate. Ships appear in sealstones and fresco fragments like elongated fish, suggesting that seafaring was not merely practical but part of the sacred imagination, a way to meet the unknown with ritual efficacy. Minoan seals are small, private instruments that reveal glimpses of mythic worlds. On these stones, animals, gods, and scenes of ritual are compressed into a few millimeters, like spells preserved in relief. The seals circulated, worn on cord or amulet, and acted as personal markers of identity and devotion, intimate connections between wearer and divine protector. Color mattered. The blues and reds and vibrant yellows of frescoes are not mere decoration, they are choices that communicated vitality and mood. Blue can evoke sea or sky, red can mark blood, life, and intensity, and white can signify purity or light. To walk through painted halls was to be immersed in a sensory theology where color carried meaning as surely as speech. Architecture itself is theology in stone. The way a doorway narrows, how a corridor slants, the placement of a throne room or shrine, these are all statements about relation and power. The palace was a machine for making the sacred legible. It choreographed movement so that entry, procession, and encounter could be learned and repeated until they felt inevitable. The political and the sacred were entangled in palace life. Kingship, or rulership, was not merely administrative but ritualized, with the ruler acting as mediator between people and gods. Whether a king was divine, semi-divine, or simply a privileged ritualist, his or her role was performed in a landscape where ceremony gave authority its weight. Writing in Minoan Crete remains one of the mysteries that keep scholars awake at night. The undeciphered script known as linear survives on clay tablets and inscriptions, hinting at administrative and perhaps ritual records that the Minoans kept. Although we can read trails and inventories from later Mycenaeans using Linear B, the Minoan language may be forever locked from us. Still, the signs tell us there was a literate dimension to their spiritual life. Sound and music likely filled ritual spaces. Lyres and pipes are depicted in art, and rhythmic drumming would match the step of dancers and the chant of prayers. Music is an ephemeral memory, but its probable presence gives us a sense of ceremony as sensual and sonic, with rhythms that knotted body to belief. Dance itself appears in frescoes as a practiced, communal act. Men and women stand in lines, arms raised or hands linked, implying choreography that bound people to each other and to the gods. Movement in ritual is a language. Pace, posture, and turning can enact myth and law without a single word spoken. The Minoans had a cyclical sense of time, anchored in agricultural seasons and maritime patterns. Rituals followed harvests and planting, births and deaths, creating an annual liturgy that marked the passage of family and community life. Time, in such a worldview, is less a straight line than a wheel whose spokes are rites that keep the village and the palace in sync with nature's tempo. Mortality and the afterlife were addressed through burial customs and votive practices. Tombs, grave goods, and funerary offerings suggest beliefs about continuity after death, even if the precise theology remains elusive. Objects buried with the dead, pottery, jewelry, weapons, testify to a conviction that the deceased had needs and identity beyond the visible horizon. Comparisons with contemporary cultures help us read fragments of meaning. Minoan practice intersected with Egyptian and Near Eastern beliefs through trade, and certain motifs, winged creatures, composite animals, and ritual tableaus reverberate across the Mediterranean. Yet the Minoans remain distinctive in their emphasis on nature, fluid space, and female presence in sanctity. The arrival of Mycenaean Greeks on Crete brought change, perhaps through conquest, intermarriage, or cultural synthesis. Linear B tablets record names and commodities on Crete in later centuries, and Mycenaean iconography overlays earlier Minoan forms. What was once a living island religion shifted into new frameworks, and older images were adapted into the Greek mythic system. Historiography itself shapes the story of the Minoans. The very name Minoan comes from the myth of Minos, and an 18th century archaeologist's choice of labels now structures how generations interpret the island's past. The story of Knossos was partly rewritten by modern viewers who sought continuity with Homeric tales, so our reading must always account for the lens of later imagination. Archaeology reconstructs temples from shards, and these reconstructions are both gift and limitation. A palace corridor can be floored and painted in a modern mind, but the original light, smell, and sound remain partly hypothetical. Still, the physical traces, ash pits, post holes, painted plaster, are stubborn testimonies that help us imagine the rituals that filled those spaces. Objects of devotion were often beautiful and carefully made, because making is a form of prayer. Pottery with swirling marine motifs, delicate gold cups, and stone ceilings were crafted with care, and their craftsmanship honors the intentions behind them. Craftsmanship in a ritual context transforms labor into offering, making every finished object an embodied petition. The sea's commerce brought not only wealth but mythic cross-pollination. Through trade routes goods and ideas moved, a goddess image traveled, a pottery form adapted, a ritual gesture copied and remade. Crete sat at a crossroads of the ancient world, and those exchanges enriched, not erased, the local spiritual vocabulary. Iconography sometimes gives us hints of myths that never reached the later Greek corpus. Composite creatures, birds with human faces, women clasping horns, creatures that combine sea and land, suggest stories that circulated in oral tradition but were not fixed in stone. These images are invitations to imagination. They suggest a mythic world as varied and changing as the sea itself. The palace storehouses, filled with pithoi, were both economic heart and symbolic belly. Grain, oil, and wine were lifelines, and their storage in palace contexts connects sustenance to ritual redistribution. The palace's control over staples thus became a ritualized symbol of care and power, one authority that ensured the community's survival and its obligations to the divine. Ritual purity and pollution likely governed who could enter which spaces and when. The presence of threshold rituals, perhaps a washing of hands or anointing with oil, appears indirectly in art and architecture. Purity practices shape how people relate to the sacred, and they structure access so that certain moments become dense with meaning. The visual language of seals, frescoes, and pottery also encoded social identity. Dress, hair, and jewelry denote rank and role, and in ritual representation these markers clarify who speaks, who leads, and who receives. Clothing in ritual is a public declaration. Textiles and ornament are not mere fashion but visible theology. Religious calendars must have been marked, though not in numbers we can decipher. Festivals, seasonal processions, harvest rites, or maritime commemorations tied the community to recurring moments that structured hope and memory. The anticipation of ritual can be as important as the act itself, as the preparation transforms ordinary days into sacred expectation. The body was a central medium for religion. Scars, tattoos, ornaments, and posture all marked a life under devotion. Tattoos or temporary body paint, we can infer, might have signaled initiation or rank, and jewelry could function as talisman and promise. The body becomes a living text of faith, a public ledger of where one stands in relation to the gods. Sacred animals beyond bulls had roles and meanings. Birds, for instance, appear in frescoes and seals as messengers or as beings that bridge air and land. The hawk or dove's flight can be read as a pathway between realms, a natural conduit through which omen and blessing arrive. Offerings placed in niches, in caves, and under rocks are the Minoans' whispers to eternity. Small and private votives tell us that devotion was not only public performance but intimate conversation. A child might leave a clay animal for a promise, a merchant might offer a seal for safe passage, and those gestures accumulate into a culture's moral and spiritual economy. The tension between nature's generosity and its danger is a constant theme. A storm that feeds or floods, a bull that sires and kills, a sea that offers cargo and swallows ships, such ambivalence shapes ritual strategy. Worship, in part, is an attempt to manage unpredictability, to create relationships that mitigate chaos through regular acts of respect and reciprocity. Sacramental objects often incorporate animal forms, embedding the sacred in the familiar. Cups carved like shells, rider shaped like bulls, and figurines with animal companions make worship tactile. To drink from a vessel shaped like a creature is to take a ritual moment into the mouth, to mix daily life with holy mediation. The later Greek world folded many Minoan elements into its myths, reinterpreting gods and places for a different theology. Minos becomes an underworld judge, Ariadne a helper and perhaps a goddess, and the labyrinth becomes a moral tale of heroism and cunning. This reframing obscures some original meanings but also preserves the echo of a vanished ritual reality. There is an elemental honesty in Minoan devotions. Stones, shells, and clay become conveyors of hope. The materials are local and honest, and that honesty signals a theology rooted in immediate contact with the world. For an audience attuned to the sea and sky, to give a shell or a clay figurine is an apt language for petition and thanks. Experimental archaeology has helped bring ritual to life. Reconstructions of fresco pigments, replicas of pottery, and reenactments of bull leaping provide sensory insight. These experiments cannot fully restore the past, but they allow modern bodies to ask ancient questions about risk, color, and motion. Walking the alignments of a remodeled hall or hearing a reconstructed lyre's tone gives us a visceral sense of what the ancients experienced. The labyrinth appears on Minoan seals and in carved stone, sometimes paired with images of goddesses. In later cultural appropriation it became a symbol for a lost matriarchy, but on Crete it was likely more multifaceted, an implement, a ritual sign, perhaps an emblem for palatial ritual authority. It is a striking example of how an object can carry many meanings across time and people. The idea of the palace as a microcosm of the cosmos is compelling. Storerooms hold the island's bounty, inner shrines hold the island's secrets, and courts hold its disputes and celebrations. The palace stands like a religious machine that, when operated right, ensures the cyclical return of prosperity and rain. Such structures can be read as the embodiment of social faith, places where belief is administered as carefully as grain. Childhood and initiation may have been shaped by ritual practice, although the evidence is subtle. Figurines of small scale and paintings of youthful participants suggest rites that mark the passage from child to adult. Initiation rituals, if they existed, would teach the embodied skills of ritual life, how to approach an altar, how to sing, and how to move in time with others. The archaeological record also tells stories of repair and renewal. Palaces were repeatedly rebuilt, frescoes patched and repainted, and courtyards rearranged. This act of repair is itself a ritual of continuity. Reaffirming a sacred landscape through careful mending keeps the web of belief intact across generations. Climate and environment shape belief as much as they shape daily subsistence. Droughts, storms, and seismic events reconfigured expectations and rituals. People who lived with such volatility created practices that acknowledged contingency, rituals that contained anxiety through repetition and communal participation. The eruption on the island of Thera, modern Santorini, left a mark on the psyche of the Mediterranean. Its ash and waves may have disrupted harvests and trade, and in the layering of memory it becomes one of the disasters that ritual must answer. Whether it triggered mythic transformations or only practical adjustments, such an event forces religious practices to adapt and sometimes to be reinvented. Images of processions carve a repeated rhythm into Minoan art. Figures move in column and circle, and the act of procession itself is a spatial prayer. To move together through ordered space affirms social ties, and when the procession meets an altar or a shrine, the communal movement becomes an offering of time itself. These images suggest a society in which ritual choreography was a primary means of social coherence. The Minoan sense of sacred kingship is both intimate and public. Rulers might have been temple keepers, administrators, and military leaders all at once. Their role fused governance with cosmic mediation. Their authority rested on ritual legitimacy as much as force, which explains why palace symbolism and state ritual maintained such close correspondence. Minoan craft traditions, metalworking, pottery, painting, were often embedded in religious production. Gold jewelry might be made for a shrine, and a beautifully painted cup could be used in a libation. The elevation of craft to ritual importance sanctifies labor, turning ordinary skill into contribution to the community's spiritual life. The continuity of certain motifs across centuries on the island suggests a durable worldview that resisted sudden erasure. Even after Mycenaean influence grows, many forms remain recognizably Minoan, indicating a cultural resilience. Ritual and image create memory, and memory outlives single political regimes as it passes from parent to child in patterns of worship and story. A sense of the mysterious seems to pervade every painted corridor and carved niche. The Minoans left deliberate gaps, silent spaces where sound and smell mattered more than images. To enter such a space is to be invited to listen and to feel, to imagine the sacrality that no fresco could fully tell. Symbols became palimpsests, an image could be read in many tongues. A bull could be animal, god, or social emblem. A woman could be priestess, goddess, or ancestor. This polyvalence allowed ritual language to be adaptively precise. Meaning could shift as context demanded, while images preserved continuity. The afterlives of Minoan rituals in later Greek religion, and in modern imagination, are unpredictable and instructive. Some motifs were absorbed into Olympian tales, others disappeared, and still others were reinvented into new cults. The story of Minoan spiritual life is therefore a story of survival and transformation, as beliefs migrate and mutate across time. Modern visitors to Crete still feel the pull of the ancient palaces under their feet. The ruins are weathered, but the light through columns and the curve of thresholds can still suggest processions and painted seasons. Standing there, it is easy to imagine the resonance of an old chant or the smell of smoke in a sacred courtyard, sensations that bridge past and present. The Minoan imagination flourished in hybrid forms: animal-human, sea-land, sky-earth. These hybrids express a worldview that refuses simple separation and invites beings to cross domains. Such hybridity is a spiritual strategy, a way of acknowledging complexity in the living world and finding ritual languages that can hold it. There is an ethical dimension to Minoan practice that emerges when we consider the work of ritual. To feed the gods, to care for sacred animals, to participate in communal feasts, is to accept responsibilities that extend beyond the individual. Ritual thus binds people and obligations to one another and to the land, forming a moral ecology of reciprocity. The role of textiles and weaving in symbolic life should not be underestimated. Textiles represent domestic labor and craft skill and can serve as votive gifts or markers of status. The act of weaving is itself a metaphor for social fabric, threads crossing and knotting to make a whole, and that metaphor would be powerful in ritual contexts. When we imagine Minoan myths, think of stories told near hearths and along seashores, stories of storms, bulls, and cunning sailors. Oral tradition would have carried regional variations, and storytellers adapted myth to local meaning. These stories were living instruments, recalibrated each time they were told to fit new circumstances. The presence of infants and children in some votive assemblages suggests rites that sheltered life. Fertility cults likely emphasized protection for mothers and infants, and votive offerings might have been dedicated in thanks for births or in plea for healthy children. This focus on continuity explains why so many domestic items find their way into sacred deposits. Archaeological stratigraphy shows palaces rebuilt after fire or collapse, and each rebuilding is a cultural conversation about continuity and innovation. Rebuilding may involve reaffirmation of old rites or introduction of new ones, and thus the archaeological record maps religious as well as political change. The layers in the earth become a liturgy etched in soil and ash. The interplay of light and shadow in Minoan architecture is itself ritualistic. Open courts allow full sun while inner rooms remain dim, and thresholds mark transitions from public visibility to private seclusion. Light guides attention, and the management of illumination is a subtle but powerful form of sacrality, indicating where the gaze should rest. The senses were probably trained in ritual contexts: the scent of incense, the feel of polished stone, the sound of footsteps on flagstones. Ritual education shapes sensory memory, teaching a person to recognize a god's presence as surely as teaching a child to recognize a parent's face. Such embodied pedagogy makes religion durable because it is felt as well as believed. Even the names that survive, borrowed into Greek, morph in the telling. A place name becomes a person's name, a god's epithet becomes a city. This fluidity shows that myth and memory travel through language, reshaping themselves as they go. The Minoans, then, are not frozen in time but participating in a long human conversation that extends into later cultures. Votive caches found in caves and at sanctuaries are the ancients' diaries in clay and metal. They record private anxieties and public thanks, an archive of small lives etched in durable materials. Taken together, they reveal a society attentive to the precariousness of survival and eager to secure favor through consistent practice. The interplay between the sacred and the political in rituals could also provide a stage for dissent or negotiation. To attend a festival is to be seen and counted, to occupy a sacred role is to stake a claim to authority. Ritual thus becomes politics in motion, a way of expressing, contesting, and affirming social order. The aesthetic sensibility of the Minoans, an appetite for movement, color, and fluid line, infuses their sacred art. Even religious scenes avoid stiffness. Movement seems preferable to static dominance, suggesting a theology that values process over unchanging decree. Gods here are not immobile thrones but participants in life's flow. The ritual calendar no doubt included moments of communal mourning alongside celebration. When famine, disease, or natural disaster struck, communal rites would provide structure for grief and practical coordination for survival. Rituals of mourning are as important to social life as rites of feasting. They stabilize a community when the world seems to unravel. The exchange of gifts, between rulers, between communities, and between mortals and gods, took material form in the movement of objects and the performance of hospitality. Hosting a ritual feast was an act of diplomacy as much as devotion. It bound allies and reminded rivals of mutual obligations. Hospitality in ritual is a political economy of goodwill made visible through the sharing of food and space. The palaces themselves contained images that bridged divine and domestic life: dolphins on a cup, a goddess painted near storerooms, children pictured in processions. This integration indicates that religious practice watched over daily life, not merely occasional ceremony. The sacred permeated the ordinary, and the ordinary was thick with spiritual meaning. As centuries passed, the religious landscape shifted. New gods, new rituals, and new political regimes altered the shape of worship. Yet certain forms endured, and some images retained their resonance even under new names. Continuity and change weave together, preserving fragments while allowing reinvention. In contemplating Minoan religion, we confront the limits of evidence but also the richness of imagination. The fragments are enough to sketch a vibrant world: a liturgy of sea and bull, a choreography of courtyards, women who lead in painted registers, and caves full of votive echoes. This world is not simply a fossilized past, but a living echo that still moves us. Modern scholarship debates, argues, and revises, but each debate returns to fundamental human questions. How do people make meaning in a risky world? How do they bind themselves to one another? And how do they speak to forces larger than themselves? The Minoans answered these questions in fresco, in ritual, and in stone, producing a theology that was practical, poetic, and profoundly human. Think, finally, of ritual as continued presence. Every offering, every painted wall, every repaired palace meant that someone, long ago, decided to keep faith with their world. That decision, made in sun and storm, before a bull's eyes or at the mouth of a cave, remains the truest essence of Minoan spirituality, an enduring conversation with the visible and invisible world. Imagine the sea at dawn, a slow silver sheet stretching to the horizon, as calm and inevitable as breath. The Minoans lived with that horizon under their eyes, listening to its moods and trusting its gifts. Ports hummed with the commerce of 1,000 small vessels while children chased kites along sunlit harbors. Salt and wind were daily companions, and the distant line of sky and water shaped how they thought about distance and danger. They were a people of porches and frescoes, of open courtyards ringing with light. In cities like Knossos, Phaistos, and Malea, roofs sheltered painted rooms where color meant ritual. The palace complexes rose in tiers, their forms complicated and hospitable, with storage magazines and workshops woven into sites of ceremony. Life moved in rhythms of weaving, potting, and shipbuilding, all carried under a steady Mediterranean light. Minoan hands shaped clay into elegant jars, their surfaces telling stories of dolphins, lilies, and bull leapers. The touch of an artisan was evident in the thinness of a cup and the curve of a spout. Marine motifs were more than ornament, they were a language of identity, reflecting a culture whose economy and imagination were braided with the sea. Traders crossed these waters to exchange oil and wine for metals, timber, and ideas. Their ships were swift and shallow, hugging coasts and darting between islands with a kind of practiced audacity. Mariners read currents like poems and knew the names of every headland. That skill made the Aegean a small world where news, goods, and gods could travel quickly. Commerce brought wealth and variety, and wealth created centers of consumption where imported pottery lay alongside local wares. Religion flowed through daily life in an unforced way, visible in shrines tucked into domestic corners and in larger ceremonial spaces and palaces. Symbols of the bull and double axes appeared in sanctuaries and on sealstones, binding secular power with sacred imagery. People left offerings of clay, faience, and sometimes food, small acts that knitted the community together. Priests and leaders maintained rituals that kept tradition alive across generations. The palaces were not fortresses in the conventional sense, they were administrative hubs that controlled redistribution of goods and organized labor. Their labyrinthine corridors invited curious visitors into spaces of storage, reception, and festival. Central courts hosted athletic displays, and stairways ascended through painted worlds. Here the political and the ceremonial intersected, and the architecture guided the lives of those within. When you walk through reconstructions in your mind, you sense a crowding of sound, sandals, pottery clinking, conversation in a language we can no longer read. Linear A, their script, recorded transactions and names but refused to yield its entire story to us. That silence has a presence of its own, a mystery encoded in clay tablets locked in a script that has no living interpreter. Even so, the artifacts speak of complexity, of an economy that matched art with administration. Beyond the courts and storerooms, farmers worked terraces of olive and grape, coaxing yield from thin soils with practiced patience. Sheep and goats grazed on slopes while orchards produced fruit for oil and wine. Sustenance depended on seasonal cycles and on careful storage in stone-lined bins. Those quiet labors underpinned a civilization as surely as politics did. The islands and the coasts were not isolated dots, but nodes in a network that reached into Anatolia, Egypt, and the Levant. Bronze moved along these routes, tin traded for copper, and ideas flowed in shared motifs. Minoan pottery traveled far, recognized by its swirl patterns and marine scenes. The sea, practical and symbolic, was the connective tissue of a world in motion. And yet the earth beneath them had its own voice, one a Minoan world could not always ignore. Crete lay not far from Santorini, known in antiquity as Thera, a volcanic island that held a sleeping power. For generations the island had been quiet enough to be taken for granted, a blank on the horizon, until the day the silence broke. The eruption that would follow was an event of both fire and water, a catastrophic duet. The eruption began with a rumbling that built in fits, a subterranean conversation of pressure and magma that would not be contained. Magma rising through fissures heated groundwater and ancient chambers until they could no longer hold. Pressure accumulated with a patient, terrible logic before the rock finally shattered. What followed was not a single instant but a sequence of violence, explosions of ash, falling pumice, and the release of molten fury. Ash darkened the sun as though the day had been blotted by a giant hand. Light turned as if someone had dimmed the world, and breathing became labor in a sky filled with fine, choking dust. The sound of the eruption traveled, a fierce rolling thunder that might have been heard across the sea, carried by wind and water. Those who watched from a distance could see the uprising column, a mushrooming mass that blotched the horizon. As the eruption entered its convulsions, parts of the island collapsed inward, creating a caldera and displacing massive volumes of seawater. The sea, provoked by the sudden tilt and fall, responded with waves that raced outward with terrifying speed. Tsunamis pushed across the Aegean, their first surges swelling and breaking against coasts that had no memory of such force. These waves did not look like the friendly swells of a Mediterranean bay. They were walls of water that rearranged shorelines. People on ships found themselves lifted and scrubbed by sudden, immense undulations, and harbors filled and emptied with dangerous unpredictability. Boats could be smashed against quays or hurled onto beaches, their cargoes strewn like casualties. Coastal settlements that normally relied on the sea found their lifelines severed in moments of brutal rearrangement. The ocean, usually a medium of connection, became an agent of destruction. Pyroclastic flows followed close behind, superheated clouds of gas and ash that raced across land like molten air. These currents obliterated anything in their paths, searing wood, clay, and bone with unimaginable heat. No mourning song could reach those swallowed by such a flow, because the process left little for lamentation. The landscape itself was remade. What had been fields and terraces became a wasteland of ash and collapsed structures. Fallout descended far from the epicenter, smothering fields and fouling water supplies with a gritty patina. Crops that had promised food for months turned gray and died under the ash's suffocating weight. Livestock perished in barns and on pastures, and stored grains became contaminated with glassy shards of volcanic glass. Even places not directly hit by waves or pyroclastic surges felt the sting of this airborne enemy. The eruption released gases that altered weather patterns temporarily, casting a pall over the region and affecting sunlight and precipitation. Some scholars reading ice cores and tree rings have argued for a cooling effect across parts of the northern hemisphere, a brief civic winter that followed in the eruption's wake. That climatic perturbation would have influenced harvests and human migration, adding a slow fuse of hardship to the immediate catastrophes. Combined with direct destruction, these changes compounded suffering in ways both quick and prolonged. People responded in the immediacy of survival, attempting rescue where they could and hauling the injured to higher ground. There were heroic gestures, acts of improvisation that preserved lives, but also scenes of horror that make the heart tighten. Shelters filled with those who had lost roofs and family members, and water sources had to be found and purified from ash. Community bonds were stressed to the breaking point and then tested again as neighbors tried to salvage what remained. For the Minoan centers on Crete, the eruption's initial shock came as a cascade of indirect harms. The tsunamis that radiated from Thera hit shores across the southern Aegean and struck Cretan harbors and coastal settlements. Harbors were fields of scattered timbers and ruptured hulls, and many small island communities on the first line of impact were wiped out. Though some inland towns were spared direct violence, the loss of seaborne traffic and the contamination of crops immediately imperiled the economy. Ships that had once braided together a maritime economy now lay broken or stranded, and the loss of craft and captains could not be replaced overnight. Trade goods that crossed the Aegean ceased to arrive, and those that did were delayed and haphazard. Economies accustomed to steady exchange faltered under the strain of irregular seasons and supply breakdowns. Those who depended on imported metals for tools and weapons found themselves beset by shortages. Archaeological layers record those broken connections in ways that are stubbornly eloquent. On Crete, ash layers and debris from the period show a narrowing of trade networks and a drop in luxury imports. Pottery styles became more conservative in some places, perhaps reflecting tightened resources or new social priorities. Yet the picture is not uniform. Some sites show resilience, reusing old ware and attempting to maintain administrative functions. Human communities were neither entirely annihilated nor immediately flourishing again. They rebuilt in complex ways. The loss of palatial function may have been gradual rather than abrupt, with administrative systems strained and sometimes replaced by local forms of power. In a world where redistribution was central to political legitimacy, interruptions to staple flows, grain, oil, textiles, undermined authority. Palaces that had once coordinated these flows found their control slipping, and new centers of power emerged sometimes in the wake of older ones. Social order adjusted, sometimes peacefully and sometimes through contest. There is evidence that earthquakes and smaller eruptions visited Crete in the years that followed, reminding residents that the earth remained unpredictable. Repair crews would have patched roofs and rebuilt storerooms, but each reconstruction carried the memory of previous damage. Communities learned to live with risk in a new, more immediate way, even as they tried to preserve past patterns of life. That mixture of adaptation and memory is as much a part of the story as the dramatic collapse itself. Scholars have debated whether the eruption caused the collapse of Minoan civilization outright or whether it was the final blow to a culture already changing for other reasons. Some see the eruption as a singular cataclysm that unhinged political, economic, and religious systems. Others argue for a more nuanced view. The eruption accelerated processes that included social stratification, external pressures, and perhaps invasive influences from the Greek mainland. The truth likely sits somewhere between these poles, messy and historical in the way human affairs often are. The Mycenaeans of mainland Greece began to appear more prominently on Crete in the centuries after Thera's explosion. They brought with them different administrative practices and a script, Linear B, that recorded Mycenaean Greek. Where Linear B appears, it suggests a reorientation in political power, and some palaces once Minoan recovered under new rule. Elements of Minoan art and religion persisted, however, blending with Mycenaean modes in ways that were neither entirely assimilation nor pure survival. The visual world of frescoes and ceramics continued to influence later art across the Aegean. Dolphins still leapt from walls, stylized lilies still unfurled, and the bull motif retained a presence in ritual imagery. Cultural continuities and discontinuities braided together, creating a hybrid landscape where Minoan memory survived in unexpected forms. History, in this way, is less a clean break than a series of palimpsests where old images reappear under new ink. Modern archaeologists have been patient interpreters of these palimpsests, working to untangle layers of ash, collapsed walls, and reoccupation. Sir Arthur Evans in the early 20th century first popularized the idea of a sophisticated Minoan civilization centered on palaces like Knossos. His restoration work and interpretations were groundbreaking but also controversial for their imaginative reconstructions. Later excavators and scholars refined and sometimes overturned parts of his narrative, replacing grand narrative with a more detailed mosaic of evidence. The volcanic island itself has been a stubbornly revealing place, with layered deposits telling a story of repeated eruptions and shifting shorelines. Core samples of marine sediments and volcanic ash have allowed scientists to reconstruct the sequence of events with a temporal precision that early researchers could only dream of. Radiocarbon dating, tephrochronology, and ice core correlations have all been marshaled to place the eruption on a calendar of centuries. Each method carries its own uncertainties, but together they sharpen our picture. Dating the eruption has been one of archaeology's most heated debates, because a few decades can change how we line up human events. Organic material under a thick volcanic layer gave radiocarbon dates that suggested a date in the late 17th century BCE, while traditional archaeological synchronisms tied the event to later in the 16th century BCE. That discrepancy stirred argument for decades, with scholars on different sides defending their models passionately. The debate forced the field to refine techniques and to consider how scientific and cultural chronologies interact. Recent advances, including analyses of ice cores that contain volcanic sulfate spikes and dendrochronology showing tree ring anomalies, have helped reconcile some of the differences. The integration of multiple lines of evidence has moved consensus toward a date in the later 17th century BCE, though some uncertainty persists. This debate is more than an academic quarrel. It affects how we understand cultural contacts across the Eastern Mediterranean and how we map the ripples of disaster through history. The method matters because human stories rest on the scaffolding of time. The Thera eruption scale was enormous in local terms, and even in a global frame it registered as a major volcanic event. Estimates of the volume of material erupted vary, but the sheer mass of pumice, ash, and pyroclastic deposit was enough to hollow out the volcanic center and reshape the island. For those living in the region, the event carried an axis of before and after, a watershed in memory. The geological imprint remained long after the ash had settled. Geologists have mapped pumice rafts and ash beds across the Aegean and beyond, showing how far volcanic material traveled. Some pumice drifted to distant shores, where it stranded as evidence of a moment when earth and sea conspired. Inland deposits on Crete attest to ashfall that reached fertile valleys, and marine cores show distinct tephra layers that match what was found on land. In this way, the eruption wrote itself across the landscape in multiple media. Archaeologists sifting through household debris have found sudden breaks in sequences, burned deposits, and hurried abandonment in some locations. These traces could be interpreted as direct evidence of the eruption's effect on individual communities. Yet other sites show deliberate, careful clearing and reoccupation, suggesting hope and continuity even after catastrophe. Human responses were as varied as people themselves. Some fled, some stayed, some tried to repair, and some invented new livelihoods. Imagine a family in a coastal village waking to the distant thunder of the first blasts, then to ash falling like a strange, dry rain. They would collect children and animals, seek clean water if possible, and climb to a ridge for safety as the sea began to swell. The loss may have been partial: a boat, a storeroom, a neighbor. But those partial losses accumulated into a regional crisis, reshaping networks of support and conduct. Stories of such moments persisted in memory and may have been retold in song or ritual. The eruption also left a mark on the religious imagination of the region. Disasters are often read through the lens of meaning, and earthquakes and floods become signs or punishments in many traditions. Minoan iconography was rich with symbols that could be reinterpreted after trauma, and rituals may have shifted to address new uncertainties. Priestly offices and cult practices could have adapted, seeking to restore balance and appease whatever forces were imagined to govern land and sea. Classrooms of scholars continue to debate the social mechanisms of collapse and recovery. Some propose that redistribution systems simply could not withstand the shock, while others emphasize adaptive strategies that reconfigured power without total social dissolution. New archaeological techniques, from microbotanical analysis to isotopic studies, have added granularity to the story by revealing what people ate and where they moved in the aftermath. These scientific tools allow us to listen to quieter voices in the archaeological record. Isotope analysis of human bones can reveal migrations and changes in diet across generations, showing how communities adapted to shifting resources. Some individuals who lived through the eruption show isotopic signatures that suggest reliance on different food sources afterward, a sign of flexibility. Others appear to have maintained old dietary habits, indicating continuity amidst change. These small biographical traces across many remains build a human-scale narrative of adaptation. Material culture also reveals movement and exchange, as certain pottery types fade and others become common. The import of Mycenaean-style pottery into Crete after the eruption indicates a mingling of styles and possibly of people. Whether that pottery marks conquest, trade, or cultural fashion is debated, but the objects themselves testify to contact. In the long sweep of the Bronze Age, such artifacts chart the ebb and flow of cultural influence with a steady, if silent, eloquence. Another layer of the story is myth and memory. Plato centuries later would tell a tale of Atlantis, an island civilization swallowed by the sea after offending the gods. Though Atlantis is no direct map of Thera, the parallels fired imagination and prompted speculation that an ancient memory of a cataclysm had been folded into legend. Myths are not literal records, but they preserve emotional truths, the sense of loss, the warning in the suddenness of nature, and the persistence of sorrow across generations. Poets and philosophers after the Bronze Age used the language of flood and fire to speak about hubris and fate. Stories of inundation and divine retribution echo through centuries, becoming metaphors for human fallibility. Memory of a catastrophic event can therefore be transformed into moral narrative, helping societies to process trauma at a symbolic level. This transformation is as important for cultural continuity as the physical rebuilding of walls and storerooms. Excavations on Santorini itself have been revealing in ways that alter our understanding of the eruption's human cost. The site at Akrotiri yielded well-preserved houses with elaborate frescoes, and the lack of human remains there puzzles scholars. Some propose that residents evaluated before the worst moments, perhaps guided by signs and experience. The preservation of frescoes and furniture under ash offers a haunting snapshot of life paused, frozen beneath volcanic dust. The frescoes of Akrotiri show a sophisticated aesthetic, landscapes, processions, and marine scenes that vibrate with color and movement. These paintings hint at a cosmopolitan and literate culture, capable of representing nature and ritual with subtlety. Their preservation beneath ash gives us a rare window into domestic and public art at a moment just before catastrophe. Such visual treasures help us imagine a living world interrupted, not erased. At the same time, the material record doesn't offer a single narrative for every place. Some villages were devastated completely, some palaces declined slowly, some towns persisted with only minor disruptions. Human societies are complex systems with multiple causes for change, and volcanic drama is but one of those causes. That complexity has kept scholars busy for a century, teasing out cause and consequence from the detritus of everyday life. Geophysical studies of the eruption sequence have also refined the timeline of events, showing pulses of activity that created different destructive effects. Some phases produced enormous Plinian blasts that lofted ash high into the stratosphere, while others were dominated by lateral blasts and collapse. The timing of tsunami waves relative to ash fall and pyroclastic currents mattered enormously for who survived. Understanding the sequence helps us chart human responses and survival strategies. The maritime consequences deserve particular attention because they were central to Minoan life. The loss of naval capacity damaged not only trade but defense and rescue capabilities. Fisherfolk and traders had their livelihoods destroyed, shipwrights lost raw materials and markets. Rebuilding a fleet required timber, skill, and stable trade networks, none of which returned instantly in a world shaken by climate anomalies and uncertain supplies. Over time, new political arrangements emerged in the region, some based on local power and others influenced by external actors. The Mycenaeans exerted influence on Crete and beyond, and new centers of authority took shape that were different in temperament from the earlier palaces. Writing shifted, iconography changed, and new burial practices appeared in some places. The old Minoan style did not vanish outright, but it was integrated into a changing cultural mosaic. The archaeological record of funerary practices reveals shifting beliefs about death and the afterlife. Some tombs continued long-standing forms, while others adopted styles associated with the mainland. Grave goods vary from rich sets of jewelry to simple local wares, suggesting differences in wealth and possibly in how communities valued continuity versus change. These shifts in burial patterns add another human dimension to the story of transition. For centuries after the eruption, the Mediterranean remained a theater where the memory of Thera would resonate. Mariners learned new routes and built new ships, and trade adapted to new realities. Markets reshaped and new elites took advantage of shifting opportunities. The resilience of human networks is striking. Even after shocks of great magnitude, people find ways to reconnect and reinvent livelihoods. Modern maritime archaeologists have sought sunken ships that could reveal cargoes and trade routes of the Bronze Age. Underwater excavation is painstaking and slow, but each recovered amphora or timber fragment speaks of movement and exchange. These underwater finds complement terrestrial records by showing how goods actually traveled. They allow us to reconstruct supply chains and economic ties that knit the region together before and after the disaster. As scientific techniques multiplied, so did our appreciation for the eruption's complexity and impact. Paleobotanical analysis traces how plant communities changed after ashfall, revealing shifts in land use. Soil studies show how agricultural practices were challenged by ash contamination and how irrigation and manuring were sometimes intensified to recover fertility. These ecological threads tie human survival to the mutable world of soils and seasons. The story of the Minoans and the eruption of Thera is therefore a multiscalar narrative. It stretches from the intimate, handmade pottery, a family kitchen, a frescoed room, to the continental, climate anomalies and shifting trade networks. It occupies both minutes and centuries, telling a tale of sudden violence and long-term adaptation. That duality makes it a story that resonates with modern listeners who face their own environmental uncertainties. There is a moral complexity here too, because catastrophe has no single moral lesson. It can expose human fragility and inspire solidarity at once. It can accelerate inequality, as the wealthy can sometimes protect themselves more effectively, and it can also occasion communal acts of sharing. The fragments of Minoan life we recover show generosity and self-interest, resilience and vulnerability, all braided together in the ordinary drama of survival. Excavations continue to refine our picture of Minoan society and the eruption's effects, as new techniques allow ever finer analysis. Portable X-ray fluorescence reveals chemical signatures in ceramics to trace origins and trade. Microscopic analysis of residues tells us what people ate and drank. Each technological advance is like a new lens that clarifies detail and complicates previous assumptions. Public fascination with Thera and the Minoans has fueled both scholarship and myth-making. Museums display pottery and fresco copies that inspire the popular imagination, while documentaries dramatize the eruption's power. This public appetite shapes how the past is presented and sometimes simplifies the complexity of academic debates. Yet public engagement also brings resources and attention to preservation and study. The Cretan landscape itself continues to be a palimpsest of habitation and memory, where modern towns stand near ancient ruins and farmers tend fields much as their ancestors did in some basic ways. Tourists walk frescoed halls and imagine the bright palms and dolphins depicted in pigments that sank beneath volcanic ash millennia ago. Those places are both museum pieces and living communities with their own continuity and change. What lessons can modern listeners draw from this long-ago catastrophe? One is the fragile interdependence of human systems with natural forces. A single geological event cascaded through trade, politics, and daily life in ways that were impossible to predict. Another is the remarkable capacity for recovery and reinvention. People did not simply perish in silence. They rebuilt, adapted, incorporated newcomers, and preserved parts of their culture even as they changed others. The eruption also reminds us that geography is not destiny but a condition within which human agency must operate. The Minoans were brilliant navigators of their environment, but nature's extremes sometimes overwhelmed even great skill. That tension between mastery and humility is present in every age, and it is why we remain captivated by their story. It is a portrait of human beings doing their best in an indifferent world. As the centuries marched on and the Bronze Age gave way to later epochs, elements of Minoan culture persisted, diffused, and evolved. Motifs such as the double axe or the bull leaper reappeared in varied contexts, sometimes stripped of their original meanings and sometimes invested with new ones. Cultural memory is not static, it is translated through time, and in translation it acquires new resonances. The Minoans lived on, not as a fossilized relic, but as a source of imagery and technique for later peoples. Archaeology itself is a kind of rescue mission, an attempt to bring voices from the past back into the present with dignity and context. Each shard of pottery, each grain of pollen, is a whisper that, when multiplied, becomes a chorus. That chorus tells us about everyday toil and ceremonial splendor alike, about disaster and resilience, about the way a people looked at their sea and their sky. Listening to that chorus requires patience and humility, and it rewards us with a sense of continuity across millennia. You can imagine sitting by a modern harbor on Crete, feeling the same sea breeze that once fluttered frescoed curtains in Minoan homes. The smell of salt and thyme still comes off the rocks, indistinguishable from what it might have been then. In that sensory continuity there is both comfort and a sobering reminder of time's power. The past is near enough to touch in that way, and yet it remains distant in its silent registers of language and personal names. When we think of the eruption today, we do so with instruments and models that would be invisible to ancient peoples. But the core human story remains accessible. People contended with a sudden change, suffered losses, and made decisions about how to survive. Those decisions included leaving, staying, rebuilding, and adapting livelihoods. The factual questions about ash volume and tsunami height matter to specialists, but the human choices resonate with anyone who confronts loss. The Minoans' artistic legacy continues to influence modern aesthetics, from furniture and ceramic design to theatrical motifs that draw on bull-leaping imagery. Contemporary artists find in Minoan forms a combination of motion, elegance, and mystery that still speaks across time. In that continuing dialogue, the past becomes a resource for new creation rather than a museum piece locked against reinterpretation. Culture is always a living conversation. Finally, the eruption of Thera stands as an emblem of how nature and human history are intertwined in ways we are still learning to read. It teaches us to respect complexity, to weigh multiple causes, and to listen to subtle evidence from soils and ice cores as well as to the bold strokes of architecture. It invites us to imagine individual lives within a broad sweep of geology and politics. And in that imagining we honor both the small and the large, the simple acts of daily life and the immense forces that sometimes upend them. So when you drive and the landscape blurs beyond the window, think of the palaces and the sea and the ash that once fell like a strange rain. Think of artisans shaping clay, of mariners reading currents, of families climbing to higher ground as waves rushed in. Remember that history is not a dry chronicle of dates, but a landscape of choices and consequences. The eruption that shattered a civilization is also a story about the ways people respond to disaster, and those responses continue to shape human communities to this day. Close your eyes if you need to and imagine the blue of an inland sea that never seems to sleep, the same sea that lapped at the shores of a civilization whose name we now call Minoan. It is a name stitched from later scholarship and myth, but the people who lived here between roughly 3,000 and 1,000 years before the Common Era made a world of light, color, and motion that left echoes long before classical Greece rose to fame. As you listen, picture the island of Crete spilling into bays, cliffs, and fertile plains, a place where the scent of time mixed with salt and smoke, and where human hands turned stone into corridors and courtyards, and clay into vessels for oil and wine. To begin, place yourself at the center of an ancient town beneath the shadow of a palace, not a gloomy fortress but a busy, luminous complex of rooms, stairways, storage magazines, and open courts. The palaces of Knossos, Phaistos, Malea, and Zakros were not isolated citadels but the throbbing cores of economic and ritual life, full of workshops, administrative tablets, and frescoed walls. These were built in stages across centuries, patched and repaired after earthquakes, extended in prosperity, and painted with scenes that mixed the everyday and the sacred, children running, priests in motion, dolphins leaping through stylized waves. Walk with me through the central court of a palace where sunlight pours down onto a hard-packed ground and the air hums with voices. You can almost hear merchants bargaining in 1,000 quiet tones, the shuffling of sandals, the slap of ropes as sailors secure amphorae full of oil and wine. Around this court, people moved with purpose, palaces managed grain, craft goods, and tribute, but they also staged ceremonies that tied community to mountain sanctuaries and sea shrines. The architecture itself is a language. Columns painted a deep red taper downward, reversed from the later Greek pattern. Light wells and staircases create a rhythm of shade and sun. Walls are plastered to a smooth brightness and then painted with pigments mixed from local minerals, seashells, and charcoal, creating frescoes that aim to capture movement rather than still solemnity. Minoan frescoes are one of the clearest windows into their world, because they freeze motion, a bull charging across a court, a procession of richly dressed figures, a priestess with her hair and robe blown by an unseen breeze. These images were not mere decoration. They recorded ceremonies, expressed ideals of beauty and balance, and linked human beings to animals and the sea in a continuous choreography. The color palette favored brilliant blues and reds, ochres and white, colors that still feel modern because they celebrate life so directly. Spend a moment on the sea that surrounds Crete. The Minoans were sailors, not in the romanticized sense of lone heroes, but as practical navigators of winds, stars, and currents who moved goods and ideas across the eastern Mediterranean. Their ships are visible in the artwork, narrow, swift hulls that hugged coastlines and could also sail open waters, bringing cedar from Lebanon, copper from the Anatolian interior, pottery styles exchanged with Cyprus, and perhaps delicate pigments or perfumes from Egypt. Trade is the first economy of the Bronze Age Mediterranean, and for the Minoans that meant an astonishing reach. Amphorae stamped with emblems moved like currency, storerooms heaved with pitoi long enough for small people to stand inside. Olive oil, wine, textiles, and crafted metal objects left Minoan ports and reappeared in far-flung households. In return, raw materials like tin and precious stones arrived, fueling artisans and elites alike. The economy had layers both visible and invisible. Workshops hummed with activity, potters turned fine kamars were on wheels, painters rendered the marine style that so perfectly captured fish and octopus, and metalworkers beat bronze into blades and decorative pins. Behind them were farms that produced grain, vineyards that ripened purple grapes, and olive orchards that yielded oil both for cooking and for ritual lighting. Textiles were spun and dyed, and the ubiquity of spindle whorls reminds us that clothing and woven goods were widespread household products. It is easy to imagine Minoan society as smooth and harmonious, and many scholars of the past painted a golden picture of a peaceful island civilization. Yet the evidence resists a simple story. There is strength and resilience, but also competition and disruption. The palaces were rebuilt repeatedly, which speaks to both catastrophe and determination. They were also focal points of power, where administrators kept records, stored surplus, and orchestrated redistributions. Record-keeping took forms we are still learning to read. The Minoans wrote in a script we call Linear A, inscribed on clay tablets and ceilings, used mainly for accounting and short notes. Linear A has not been fully deciphered, and its silence is a stubborn question mark, a voice we can almost hear but not yet understand. Later, the Mycenaeans adapted the script into Linear B and wrote a form of early Greek that scholars have deciphered, but Linear A guards its secrets and teases us with glimpses of an older language and culture. The lack of a full decipherment leaves space for imagination and careful hypothesis. We can see the structure of palatial administration in clay tags and sealed jars, a bureaucracy that tallied grain and goods, assigned labor, and recorded offerings to shrines. The administrative system suggests an organized society with specialists, scribes, warehouse managers, and craft supervisors. This bureaucracy, however, was not necessarily central in the way later empires were central. It was a web of local and regional controls anchored by elaborate palaces. Religion threads through the Minoan tapestry like a bright string. A goddess figure recurs in small figurines, in frescoes, and on seal stones, often associated with animals, especially bulls and birds. Sacred trees and horns of consecration, stone representations of bulls' horns, appear atop shrines and palace rooftops. These motifs suggest a faith that linked fertility, nature, and human prosperity, a religion expressed in open-air peak sanctuaries and cave shrines as much as in palace rooms. One of the most famous motifs is the bull. Bull-leaping scenes depicted in frescoes and ceilings show acrobats grasping horns or launching themselves over a bull, a dramatic image that unites danger and ritual. We still debate whether such scenes show an athletic sport, an initiation rite, or a symbolic performance with dancers and a trained animal. Regardless, the image communicates a society that embraced risk and spectacle as part of its sacred calendar. Caves and mountain sanctuaries punctuate the Minoan landscape. High places like Mount Juctus hosted peak sanctuaries where people brought offerings of clay figurines, votive limbs, and miniature boats. These sanctuaries could be intimate and local, places where families interceded for rain, harvest, or safety, and they could also hold broader communal rituals that knit scattered communities together. The sacred landscape extended beyond stone temples. It included groves, rivers, and sea cliffs as living elements of belief. The palaces themselves contained ritual spaces, lustral basins for purification, light wells that may have been part of mystery rites, and internal courts where processions could gather. The intertwining of administrative and sacred functions suggests rulers who drew authority from religious symbolism, or priests who wielded administrative power, or perhaps a sophisticated collaboration between both. Symbols of authority, seals, scepters, and the decoration of spaces were constantly on public display. Artisans left behind small but eloquent objects, carved seal stones used to mark ownership, tiny ivory carvings that show exquisite attention to flesh and fabric, glazed beads, and amulets meant to be worn. These objects circulated widely and often bear motifs that link religion to everyday life: birds perched on the wrist, spirals signifying waves or life cycles, and the ubiquitous double axe that still puzzles scholars with its potent symbolic charge. Around every wrist and neck there was a story being told. The colors in Minoan art were not accidental. Blue often indicated the sea and the sky, a vastness to which the Minoans constantly paid homage. Red could signal vitality and human flesh, while white might be clothing or light. Pigments were mixed with binders and applied to fresh plaster for true frescoes or to dry plaster for tempera, each technique producing different textures and levels of permanence. The painters knew how light on wet paint would change perception across the day, and they used that knowledge to make scenes come alive. In addition to visual splendor, the Minoans mastered water management in ways that shaped palace life. They built drainage systems, cisterns, and clay pipes that channeled rainwater and wastewater, reflecting an understanding of urban sanitation far beyond what one might expect from the Bronze Age. Such engineering smoothed daily life and also protected valuable storerooms from moisture, allowing palatial economies to function reliably across seasons. Burial practices show both commonality and variety. Elite burials often occurred in chamber tombs with rich grave goods, ornate jewelry, weapons, and imported items from across the eastern Mediterranean, while ordinary citizens might be buried in tholos tombs or simple pits. The dead were accompanied by offerings that suggest beliefs in an afterlife, or at least a continuing relationship between the living and the ancestors. Over time, burial styles changed, reflecting shifts in society and the influence of contacts from mainland Greece and beyond. The Minoan world was not static. Its history is best read in phases. Early Minoan villages and fortified settlements slowly gave way to the first palaces, which then expanded in complexity during the Middle and Late Bronze Age. Periods of destruction and rebuilding appear across the island. Earthquakes rippled through architecture, fires blackened walls, palaces were repaired and sometimes redesigned. These cycles of collapse and renewal are part of the story of resilience and transformation. One of the great ruptures in the region may have come from the eruption of the volcanic island of Thera, modern Santorini, a cataclysmic event that shook the eastern Mediterranean around the mid-2nd millennium BCE. Ash reached the skies, the sea was disturbed, and coastal communities felt the aftermath in waves and climate effects. Yet the role of Thera in the decline of the Minoan palaces is debated. It was a blow, but the complex web of political and social changes that followed likely involved trade disruptions, new powers rising on the mainland, and internal stresses as well. From the ashes of palatial Crete, the Mycenaeans from mainland Greece began to step into positions of power. Mycenaean pottery appears in Minoan contexts and, increasingly, Mycenaean influences transform local art and architecture. Eventually, linear B tablets found at Knossos record a form of early Greek administration overlaying an older Minoan system. This transition was not overnight. It was a process of intermingling, adaptation, and, at times, domination. Even as new powers rose, Minoan cultural echoes persisted. The Greeks inherited myths and motifs that had their shapes in Bronze Age Crete. A king named Minos entered Greek legend, ruling a labyrinthine palace and demanding tribute of youth, yet this myth is an afterlife of memory and reinterpretation. The labyrinth may echo actual palace complexity, or it may be symbol and metaphor, a later culture's attempt to narrate what older palatial spaces had meant. Archaeologists brought the Minoans back into the modern imagination in the early 20th century, and the work of Sir Arthur Evans at Knossos is central to that rediscovery. Evans cleared rooms, reconstructed frescoes, and created a narrative of an advanced, peaceful Minoan civilization. His restorations were visionary and controversial because they used modern materials and artistic license to rebuild ancient spaces into a coherent aesthetic that he felt captured their grandeur. Evans' choices forced later scholars to wrestle with questions of authenticity and interpretation. His reconstructions shaped visitors' imaginations, but they also masked layers of the past under modern plaster and paint. Subsequent archaeologists have debated which parts of a ruin to reconstruct and what it means to shape the past for public consumption. This tension between restoration and conservation continues to animate museums and excavations to this day. Excavation techniques have evolved. Early digs were sometimes aggressive, aimed at rapid discovery and display. Later practice emphasizes context, precise recording, and sensitive conservation. Stratigraphy, reading layers of deposits, reveals the timeline of construction, destruction, and rebuilding. Radiocarbon dating refined chronologies, aligning pottery typologies with absolute dates and making sense of the overlapping phases of Minoan life. The reach of Minoan influence extended along trade networks that stitched islands and coasts together into a shared circuit of goods and ideas. From Egypt to the Levant, to the Anatolian shore and Cyprus, Minoan objects appear in tombs and ports. They were not mere commodities. When a Minoan cup reached an Egyptian burial, it carried makers' marks and styles that spoke of Crete's taste and technique, creating a visual language recognized across cultures. When you listen closely to artifacts, you discover a conversation between cultures. Egyptian motifs appear in Aegean seals and vice versa. Exotic materials arrived and were transformed by Minoan hands into local shapes, giving the island a cosmopolitan sheen without losing its distinctiveness. Crete was a node in a larger web, a place where sea captains, traders, and craftsmen exchanged not just goods but stories and rituals. Language is the most tantalizing silence. Linear remains undeciphered, and so the songs and treaties, the myths and jokes of Minoan folk culture, remain locked away. Yet words survive in later Greek myths that echo older names and rituals. The memory of Minoan Crete became a mythic reservoir for Greek poets who reshaped it to fit their purposes, blending history and imagination. As you drive past a modern coastline, imagine a Minoan harbor bustling with boats. Sailors tied up amphorae, rowers hauled in nets, and merchants carried goods to markets shadowed by palace walls. The harbor was a stage where the practical and the ritual met, offerings were cast to sea deities, and daily commerce fed the circulation of goods that sustained palaces and households. Material culture reveals daily rhythms. Cooking pots show what people ate: grain porridge, roasted fish, olives and oil, legumes, and sweet treats flavored with honey. Bread was central, ground on hand mills, shaped and baked. Wine was stored in amphorae, not as mere luxury but as staple for feasting and ritual, consumed diluted or pure depending on the occasion. Women are prominent in Minoan imagery. Priestly figures, attendants, and everyday scenes often show women in central roles, dressed in layered garments with open bodices or elaborate sleeves. Some have used this iconography to argue for female-centered rituals or even a matriarchal society, but the archaeological record resists such simplistic claims. Power in Minoan society was complex and variegated, with elite females visible in art yet operating within structures that also valued male authority in other contexts. Manufacturing technologies were sophisticated. Bronze production required copper and tin, and the Minoans were part of long-distance exchange networks that brought those metals to the island. Metallurgy produced tools, weapons, and ritual objects whose forms were both functional and symbolic. The shine of bronze in a tomb or on a ceremonial platform would have carried meanings of status, skill, and connection to far horizons. Pottery styles are a kind of clock for archaeologists. Early geometric designs gave way to the refined kamars ware with its light-on-dark polychromatic decoration, and later to naturalistic marine motifs with octopus tentacles and dolphins that seemed to swim across a pot. Each style spreads and changes, reflecting taste, trade, and workshop innovation. Pottery is both domestic and diplomatic. It served the table and served as a gift or trade item that could represent a whole workshop's reputation. Seal stones, carved tiny cylinders or plaques, were personal and administrative tools. They stamped impressions into wet clay to secure storerooms or mark ownership, and the images they left behind were miniaturized artworks. Seals show gods and animals, hunting scenes, and religious emblems, and they tied individuals to larger networks of authority through imagery recognized across palatial domains. Gardening and agriculture shaped diets and landscapes. Olives and grapes were economic mainstays, grown in terraced fields that conserved precious soil. Cretans also coaxed saffron from crocus bulbs, the delicate red stigma that later civilizations prized, and they cultivated barley and wheat for bread. The agricultural year structured social life, pruning and harvesting, pressing oil and gathering grapes, rhythms that repeated and tied communities to the land. The sea provided food beyond trade. Fishermen fished the rich coastal waters for tuna and smaller fish, and marine imagery on pots suggests both a respect for and an intimacy with sea life. Shellwork, fish bones, and salt all tie into a maritime economy that was both material and symbolic. Fishermen's knowledge of seasons and currents was as vital as any stored grain to the community's survival. The Minoans also left behind more intimate evidence of domestic life, loom weights for weaving, needles and combs, and toys or games that suggest children playing in court shadows. Homes were lived in places with hearths and storage benches, patios and rooftops where laundry dried and infants were rocked in simple slings. This domestic architecture folds into larger palatial life because households supplied labor and received protection and redistribution from palaces. Myths often absorb older realities and transform them. The Minotaur, the labyrinth, the figure of Minos who demanded tribute, these later Greek images refracted Bronze Age memories through hymn and drama. Myths became a cultural sediment, preserving fragments of the past while altering them to fit new moral and political agendas. The story of Theseus and the Minotaur blends island memory with mainland heroics, showing how historical depth becomes narrative gold. Modern encounters with Minoan remains continue to be stories of discovery and debate. The National Archaeological Museum in Athens and local museums in Crete display fresco fragments, jewelry, and tools that draw visitors like moths to light. But museums also carry responsibilities, conserving fragile pigments, contextualizing artifacts ethically, and acknowledging histories of excavation that often reflect colonial-era power dynamics. Restoration choices confront the public with living choices about the past. Should we recreate a painted room to its supposed former brilliance, risking the insertion of modern materials? Or should we present ruins as they are, fragile and fragmentary, trusting the imagination to fill gaps? There is no single correct answer, but the conversation matters because it shapes how people understand the past and how they connect those pasts to present identities. Tourism ties modern economies to ancient ruins in complicated ways. Crete's economy benefits from visitors who walk the same stones that once supported frescoed courtyards, but tourism can also strain sites with foot traffic, pollution, and the commercialization of heritage. Local communities often find pride in archaeological centers, and they also demand a say in how their histories are presented and protected. Scientific advances keep changing the story. Ancient DNA studies probe human movement, isotopic analyses suggest diets and migrations, and remote sensing reveals subsurface ruins beneath olive groves. Each new method offers potential to answer old questions, but each also brings new uncertainties. Science adds data, but human interpretation always frames how that data becomes a story. Scholars argue about causes of decline because complex systems rarely collapse for a single reason. Climate variability, earthquakes, volcanic fallout, shifting trade routes, and political upheaval all played parts. The transition to Mycenaean dominance on Crete might have been violent in some places, peaceful in others, and negotiated often as families intermarried and elites shifted loyalties. Language contact left traces beyond writing. Loanwords, names of gods, and place names migrated across seas. When a Mycenaean scribe wrote in Linear B at Knossos, he used a borrowed tool to write a language that had already absorbed Minoan administration. The palimpsest of scripts is a small but telling sign of the layered cultural interactions that characterize the Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean. The Minoans' maritime skill also contributed to technological diffusion. Shipbuilding techniques, hull designs, and seamanship methods may have moved along with pottery styles. Crete's seafarers learned from and taught neighboring islands, creating a shared corpus of nautical knowledge that later civilizations built upon. Mariners in multi-masted ships would later cross wider seas, but their ancestors' coastal hugging and island hopping created the networks that made such expansions possible. Where religion and politics met, rulers performed public rituals to reaffirm power. Processions across courts and terraces were very public demonstrations of hierarchy and piety. Participation in these events created bonds of obligation and identity. People watched and remembered, and the spectacle itself became a technology of governance. As kingdoms and palaces fade in rubble, ordinary people continue to give us traces of their lives. Pottery shards, hearthstones, children's toys, and discarded food bones fill the soil in thin, often overlooked layers. These fragments tell us about seasons, resource usage, and family life. Beneath grand narratives of palaces and kings, daily life is quiet, persistent, and revealing. Climate and ecology shaped the rhythm of life. Crete's varied microclimates supported diverse agriculture, but periods of drought would stress communities. Soil erosion and deforestation in some areas probably reduced agricultural yields, and communities adapted by terracing, irrigation, and crop choices. Human adaptations to climate over centuries show resilience, but also fragility under prolonged stress. The visual vocabulary of Minoan art often returns to the natural world: dolphins, lilies, the spiraling shell, and birds in flight. These motifs were not mere decoration but signifiers of the island's place within the living world. Art bound humans to sea and land, and in doing so created a worldview that prized movement, transformation, and connection. We cannot separate Minoan craft from the people who made it. Workshops taught apprentices how to mix glazes, tune kills, hammer bronze, and carve seals. These skills moved down generations, and in them you can sense pride, competition, and craft identities. Artisans traded patterns and secrets in the same way merchants traded jars, shaping both economy and aesthetics. Interaction with Egypt left vivid impressions. Egyptian tomb paintings occasionally depict Aegean ships and garments, and Minoan goods appear alongside Egyptian luxury in graves and palaces. These cross-cultural encounters were complex, sometimes tributary, sometimes equal, sometimes competitive. But in all of them, ideas and goods traveled, enriching both shores. The story of the Minoans also reveals the limitations of archaeological evidence and the play of imagination. Missing texts, eroded frescoes, and collapsed walls leave us to interpret silence alongside sound. Responsible storytelling balances wonder with restraint, acknowledging what we know and what remains speculative. In museums and in the field, conservationists wrestle with fragile pigments and the saltborne decay of coastal sites. Conserving a fresco means stopping invisible chemical reactions and supporting brittle plaster. Each decision to conserve or not is an ethical choice about stewardship of the past for future listeners and walkers along the shore. Archaeology in Crete has also been a journey from colonial-era excavation toward collaborative work with Cretan communities. Local voices now shape research agendas and museum narratives, demanding that their heritage be interpreted in ways that honor their living culture. This movement reframes ownership not as a possession of artifacts but as a relationship between people and place that lasts beyond any display case. The Minoan palette also influenced later artistic traditions. Naturalistic marine styles reappear in later Greek pottery with modifications, and motifs like the wave spiral travel into classical ornament. The ability to capture movement in paint, fish cutting through water, dancers bent into motion, moves through time to inform later visual languages across the Aegean. Music and performance were part of Minoan life even though few instruments survive. We infer lyres, pipes, and percussive elements from later traditions and iconography. Music likely accompanied rituals, work, and feasting, reinforcing rhythm and memory in the way that songs carry knowledge across generations. Symbols of rule, horns of consecration, double axes, and the painted throne room communicated authority across classes. The imagery tied divine favor to political legitimacy, a common ancient practice, but with Minoan nuances that emphasize nature, fertility, and maritime reach. These symbols bound communities into a shared narrative of identity and stewardship of land and sea. Craft specialization suggests social stratification. Certain families might control metalworking, others ceramics, others dye-making, each with their reputations and trade connections. Yet specialization also means networks of mutual dependence. Potters needed oil and grain, textile makers needed wool and dye, merchants needed sailors and storage. The web of interdependence was both economic and social, holding communities together through exchange. The image of the Minoan woman in frescoes and seals has inspired both scholarship and myth. She appears in ritual as a mourner, a musician, or a goddess, and her depiction provokes questions about household roles, property, and public visibility. Labels like priestess or queen are tempting, but precise titles elude us. The archaeological record gives us glimpses rather than job descriptions. Archaeological categories themselves are interpretive. When we call something a palace, a shrine, or a house, we are mapping modern concepts onto ancient spaces that might have blended functions. A courtyard could be both a market and a sacred place. A storage room could hold offerings as well as grain. Recognizing this complexity helps resist tidy, anachronistic readings of ancient social systems. Mythic echoes continue to frame Mediterranean imagination long after the palaces fell. Homeric epics mention eastern islands and kings with faint but persistent hints of older worlds. Later Greek cultural memory absorbed, reconfigured, and sometimes erased Minoan details, turning them into legends that would feed Roman, medieval, and modern imaginations. Conservation also raises questions of authenticity. Stone walls attract graffiti and tourist wear, while trafficking in antiquities still threatens unprovenanced objects. Scholars push for transparent provenance, ethical collecting, and partnerships that respect source communities. Museums worldwide now wrestle with repatriation and the moral obligations of stewardship. Today, walking the ruins of Knossos or Phaistos, you feel the layers pressing under your feet, the barefoot infants, the administrators counting oil, the priests moving offerings at dawn. The experience is both archaeological and personal, a meeting of ancient human presence with modern curiosity. These places remain alive in their ruins, speaking quietly across millennia. The story of the Minoans is not a closed book but a living conversation. Each season of excavation, each refinement in dating, and each new discovery of a seal or fresco fragment rewrites parts of the narrative. Archaeologists, conservators, local communities, and visitors all take part in shaping how the Minoan past is told and remembered. As scientific techniques sharpen, new windows open. Microbotanical analysis reveals what plants were used in rituals, residue analysis identifies foods and oils in pots, and soil chemistry uncovers ancient garden plots. These small traces reconstruct sensory worlds: the smell of incense, the taste of a spiced wine, the texture of a woven garment. Contemporary artists and writers continue to be enchanted by Minoan imagery. The labyrinth motif recurs in modern literature and music, offering a metaphor for complexity and return. Architects borrow the light-filled court and column for modern designs, while painters reimagine marine colors and spirals for new canvases. Minoan aesthetics thus remain an active source of inspiration. At the heart of the Minoan legacy is a lesson about continuity and change. Cultures do not vanish in neat endings, they transform, leaving traces in language, ritual, art, and social practice. The Minoans shaped a foundation upon which later Aegean cultures built, and their echoes persist not because they survived intact, but because they were absorbed, adapted, and reimagined. Listening to these echoes, one senses the complex layering of human lives: artisans perfecting a glaze, sailors bargaining under a wet sail, children running through courts under frescoed dolphins, and priests making offerings at a mountain sanctuary. Each layer is part of a living human story that reaches toward us through objects and ruins. The Minoan voice is both specific and oblique, and it asks us to be patient, to read fragments together, and to imagine the rest. The archaeological narrative also reminds us of humility. We cannot reconstruct private conversations or the taste of an individual meal, but we can assemble frameworks of meaning from pottery and pigment, from building outlines and botanical remains. These frameworks are not fantasies but careful constructions built on evidence, interpretation, and the readiness to revise conclusions as new data appears. The palaces continue to teach about building with local materials and adapting to environment. Their courtyard-focused plans maximize ventilation and light, and their water systems show an early grasp of urban needs. Modern architects and planners sometimes look back at such ancient solutions for lessons in sustainability and place-sensitive design. Cultural memory transformed the Minoan past into legend and myth. Where we find a painted procession in a palace, a later poet found a story. Where we find a seal stone, a later imagination found a god. This interplay between material remains and narrative formation is central to how societies remember and remake their pasts, using older fragments to craft new identities. Finally, the Minoan legacy is an invitation. It invites us to slow down and listen to quiet things: the patina on a bronze pen, the uneven brushstroke of a fresco painter, the fossilized grain pressed into storage jars. Those quiet things tell loud stories, and the better we listen, the fuller the picture becomes of a civilization that sang to the sea and built its songs into stone. The Minoan world still speaks, but only to those who stop and listen. Subscribe and write in the comments where you hear it louder, in the art they left behind or in the simple tools that once shaped their days.